To upgrade or not to upgrade? It's a question we are all faced with at one point in time or another, whether you're a full-time professional photographer, or maybe you're a hobbyist or an enthusiast, or maybe you just like to take photos on the weekend. Regardless, whichever boat you're in, the time is going to come. We're going to have to determine whether or not it makes sense from a financial perspective to upgrade your camera body or maybe your camera lens. Or maybe it's the computer that you use to edit your photos on. Regardless, whatever the equipment is, you're going to eventually get to a point in time where you have to determine whether or not it makes sense to upgrade that piece of equipment. And that's the topic of this week's video, is to discuss why I haven't upgraded my nearly 4-year-old Sony a7R Mark II. And it's a question that has arisen. It has popped up in the comments section quite frequently on my last 3 videos, and I wanted to clear that up for you today. So when the a7R Mark III was announced, I remember looking through those specs and not being super impressed by it. It wasn't anywhere close to being enough of an increase to really entice me into contemplating whether or not I should upgrade. So I really just dismissed it and went about my day. But fast forward to a few months ago when the Sony a7R Mark IV was announced, and I remember looking through those specs, and I won't bore you with all the individual details. I know there's a plethora of videos on that topic out there, but I remember looking through the specs of that, and I was thinking to myself, you know what, that's a real contender. That looks like a real reason to upgrade from the Mark II to the Mark IV. So I started to kind of contemplate the process, and I don't really make any rash decisions when it comes to larger purchases. And from a photography perspective, I consider camera bodies, new lenses, a new computer to edit the photos on, and maybe a tripod. I consider those to be the biggest purchases, and I don't really take any of them lightly. I do a lot of research to figure out exactly which one is the best route for me to go. I don't have funds just rolling in, and I need to be a little bit more careful as to where I allocate my money. So I started to think very seriously about upgrading to the a7R Mark IV, and I started to kind of go through all of the specs and all the things that would really help me out. And I knew it cost $3,500 for the body, and I started to do some research to see how much I could get for my Mark II, and I was able to determine that based off of the condition that it's in right now, I could probably expect to get about $800 for it. That would leave me with roughly about $2,700 that I'm going to have to come up with out of pocket in order to upgrade from the a7R Mark II to the a7R Mark IV. So I had that $2,700 number always in the back of my mind, and I wanted to figure out exactly if I could justify that cost. So some of the things that really jump out to me as a landscape photographer, you know, there's an abundance of amazing qualities with the R4, but not all of them get me super excited for landscape photography. But some of the things that did get me very excited were things just like the increased battery performance. It's one of the biggest issues with the Mark II is the poor battery performance, and it is pretty bad. I actually am used to carrying around 1 battery in the chamber here and then 4 additional batteries, so I travel around with 5 at all times. If I got the Mark IV, I could probably travel around with 2. 1 in the camera and 1 backup, and that would be it. The new Z battery in the Mark IV is substantially improved, and that would be a pretty big benefit. It would save me a little bit of weight, but then I started to kind of dig into that a little bit, and I'm used to carrying around 5 batteries, and they don't really weigh a whole lot, and I'm used to kind of having to take batteries out and put new batteries in and kind of refresh that cycle a little bit. I'm used to the frequency that I have to do that now, and it's not really an issue, but it would be nice to have better battery performance. And then things like the dual SD card slots. My Fuji X-T3's got dual SD card slots, which I purchased at the beginning of this year, and quite frankly, I never really use it. I'm so conditioned to, at the end of a shoot, just taking the SD cards out and immediately backing up the footage. And I probably should use SD cards, dual SD card slots for more often, I should say. But I really just don't do that right now. So that's kind of, once again, that would be a nice to have type of a feature. And then a big one for me is the a7R Mark IV, according to Sony, has a greatly improved weather sealing system. And one of the biggest issues with the Mark II, so I've heard, is it has poor weather sealing. Now the thing about that is I've never had an issue with it. I've had this camera pretty wet before, and I've also had it extremely cold before, but I'm always aware that it supposedly does have very bad weather sealing, and I believe that it does, but I've never actually had an issue. I've had it lock up a couple times, but I'm pretty comfortable when knowing when this is getting too wet. And I know when it's getting a little bit too cold, and I think I'm pretty good at managing those expectations of what it can and can't do. And then I started to think about it. If I got the Mark IV and I threw out $3,500 for it, would I feel more comfortable knowing that it has superior weather sealing? Would I then feel more comfortable letting it get more wet, or let it, you know, whatever the case may be? Would I really experience that additional weather sealing? And I don't think I would. I would still treat it just the same way I do my Sony a7R Mark II. I don't think I would feel any more comfortable letting my brand new $3,500 camera get completely soaked. So I think I would just end up just doing what I normally do and covering it up when I think it's getting too wet. So I don't think that's really going to change my workflow at all. Now, the touchscreen. This was a really big one for me, and a touchscreen is one of those things you don't know what you're missing until you try it. I've never had a touchscreen camera until I got my Fuji, which is what I film all the videos for this YouTube channel on, and I really, really enjoy it. And I've actually found myself sometimes actually pressing the back of my Sony a7R II because I'm so used to using the X-T3, and it would be really nice to have a touchscreen. It really helps for focus stacking images, the whole tap to focus. It's a lot easier than actually having to manually kind of scoot the focus point, just clicking it all throughout the screen until you get to the area that you want to focus on. So having a touch screen would be a very nice feature. It would absolutely save you a few seconds on location. The A7R Mark IV's got better dynamic range, albeit just a slight bump of dynamic range, but more dynamic range is always a good thing. And then one of the biggest features is the much improved focusing system, which is definitely a nice to have, but for landscape photography, I don't need, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of focus points, and I don't need super snappy focusing either. I usually use one focus point, and I might autofocus, but I don't need it to be quick, and a lot of times I manual focus. So having a better autofocus system isn't that big of a deal to me. But the big one, the elephant in the room, the flagship feature with the Sony a7R Mark IV is the new 61 megapixel sensor, which is almost a 50% increase over the sensor contained in the a7R Mark II, which is a 42 megapixel sensor. That's a huge increase. For landscape photography, we're always photographing very small details, whether it's twigs in the trees or pebbles or sand on a beach. There's a lot of tiny detail in our images, so having a huge megapixel count on your camera seemingly would be a very, very sought after quality. And I thought it was too, and then I dug into that a little bit further, and I started to think that, you know, I don't print billboards. I actually do very little printing, but the prints that I usually sell are usually 16 by 20. And at that size, I don't think you're going to see a real increase in quality over the a7R II and the a7R Mark IV. I should say compared to between the two cameras. So I don't really think that that's going to be that big of a deal. But the big issue that I had with that, and I kind of think the megapixels, the high megapixel count is kind of a double-edged sword, and it's the fact that this entire year, I have really had major computer issues from a storage perspective. Mainly because I decided to shoot all of my videos on this channel in 4K. I shoot them in 4K, I edit them in 4K, I export them in 4K, and it really bogs down my computer. It slows down Premiere Pro for me, and I have major storage issues. I have more external drives now than I ever have. I'm constantly offloading footage, and I think the raw uncompressed files on my Mark II is about 80 megabytes. I have heard that the uncompressed raw files on the Mark IV is north of 100 meg. That's a big increase. That's ultimately going to create more storage issues for me. It's going to slow down the software that I use even more, Photoshop, Lightroom, Premiere Pro. So that's going to be another issue. And more than likely, I'm going to have to purchase more external drives, and I'll probably have to upgrade to a new computer as well, which will be another substantial increase. So that's something I definitely had to take into account as well. So in summary, between the better battery life, the better autofocus system, the weather sealing, the touch screen, the dynamic range, the higher resolution, there's a lot to get excited about. But I kept seeing that $2,700 price tag floating here, and the thought that I might actually have to go buy another computer as well. That $2,700 started to look more like $5,700 or $6,000. So in summary, I started to think about all that, and it ultimately led me to making the decision that, you know what? The a7R Mark IV is not going to make me a better photographer. It is absolutely not going to end up taking better photographs for myself. and it's not going to make any additional revenue for me as well. And I have to start thinking that way because I'm now just passing my first year as a full-time landscape photographer, and I got to start thinking about these things as tools in order to help make an income for myself. And I just don't see how that $2,700 that I'd have to come out of pocket for is going to create any additional revenue for myself. So that's the thought track that I went into that ultimately led me to the decision of sticking with the Sony A7R Mark II. When people ask me what I'm shooting with and I tell them this, I always get the same kind of reaction. I was like, oh, really? Wow. Why are you still using that camera? And I haven't had a real compelling reason to upgrade yet. And somebody asked me in the Q&A video that I posted a few weeks ago, Mark, what would Sony have to do to entice you to upgrade from your A7R Mark II? And I kind of just jokingly said that if Sony decided to offer a free lens with the purchase of the camera body, I would do it. Obviously, they're not going to do that, but it got me really thinking, and I don't think there is anything that Sony could do on top of what they've already done. I mean, the A7R Mark IV, every spec is absolutely fantastic on that camera, and it's still just not enough to get me to upgrade because at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with the camera that I'm using, and this camera for me is going to take just as good of images as the Sony A7R Mark IV. I'm not going to really see that increase in quality, and it's definitely not going to make me any additional money either. So that was kind of the thought track that I went through, and I hope that this week's video kind of provides you maybe some additional information that you could possibly apply to your next upgrade buying decision as to whether or not you should upgrade your camera or lens or computer or whatever it is. So I hope you enjoyed this week's video. And if you did, if you could give it that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.